Morning. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Jimmy. I sort of got sidetracked into nutrition because of a personal experience that I had where I was struggling with a few health issues of my own, and eventually decided, after lots of pints of lager. Don't know if you have that here, but anyway, lager and lots of kebabs and Kentucky Fried Chicken and pizza, that because I was a famously unhealthy person. In fact, most of my friends that knew me when I was younger just cannot believe the work that I do. It just does not fit my sort of previous profile with, smoking, drinking, recreational drugs and stuff like that. Anyway, so anyway, I ended up changing my diet, partly because of meeting an elderly man that made me think about that. And I had a profound change in my health, and then I ended up getting sort of interested in nutrition. And one of the first things that I did, because I had no conception that there was this thing called nutrition really, because I'd been through medical school, of course, was I started to work in a diet clinic. Okay, and the diet clinics are basically where people come to lose weight, and what we did was, give them appetite suppressants and then sort of nod in the direction of changing their diet. I had no idea that there was anything other than this, by the way, at the time. And what I would see is individuals obviously coming, losing weight, and then, coming back a few months later, and that cycle would repeat. And then subsequently, I realised a lot of people were doing that and sort of yo-yoing with regard to weight, losing some weight, plateauing at a weight higher than the weight that they very often wanted to be, and then defaulting back to the original diet, putting that weight on, often with a bit more in addition, and then repeating that cycle sort of ad nauseam. Okay? And so over the years, I decided to try and understand what it was that caused that, and then what you might do about it. Okay? So really, this book, I've written a few books. This is my last one. This came out in the UK in January, and you might be thinking, oh, he's here to punt a book. Well, I've got some news for you. This isn't even available in the US, right? So I'm not really here to punt the book, but I'm here, if you like, to punt the information. So what I really want to talk about is why people fail so miserably taking that conventional calorie-based approach, okay, and what that basically leads to in our thinking that could work better for people. Now, a lot of what I'm going to share with you is quite scientific. I'm sure you're up for that, because what I've noticed talking to you as a group over the last day or two is that you're very clued up. Okay, you're much clued up than most of the audiences that I would normally speak to. Most of the audiences I normally speak to literally walk into the room fundamentally believing the calorie principle and everything about it. They believe that margarine is better than butter. They believe that artificial sweeteners are fantastic, blah, blah, blah. Lots of things that I don't really believe and I think are probably not true, okay? So my job in that situation is to kind of, put the other side to it. Okay, and very often we're able to do that. With you, I feel like I'm sort of singing to the choir, or whatever we call that expression. Okay, so, but I will cover a fair amount of science that really explains, I think, how people can take control of their health and their weight more easily than we're told we're supposed to do it. I'm also going to say that quite a lot of this book and what I'm going to talk about here is based on my clinical experience. So, over the last 20-odd years, I have literally treated thousands of people, and it kind of gives you a perspective on what sort of generally works, what doesn't work so well. And then the other little component here is, in my view, common sense, because to me, eating healthy is very intuitive, actually. We've just been sort of taught out of that position very often because of factors that Denise just mentioned. Do you know what I mean? Sometimes the information that you get about health and, for example, what we should eat isn't necessarily based on what is best for public health, but on something else beginning with the letter P, which is profit. Yes, I think that has something to do with it. Let's not get too political. We don't need to get bogged down in this, but obviously we need to vaguely bear it in mind. That's how we can reconcile how it can be that there's a yawning gap between what we're told repeatedly and what looks like the truth, once you start to look at the science, for example. Okay, so I missed that bit that Jimmy was talking about with Jack Cruz being sort of taken from the ship, okay, taken from us, so cruelly. But I don't know whether you know, but his talk was going to be called Factor X, okay? So I thought I would call this presentation Factor Y. Why would you even bother to eat, for example, low carb or paleo? Or something of that nature. A lot of this presentation is really about that. And what I sort of rail against very often in practice or when I'm speaking is the calorie principle, okay? Now, I know you'll be familiar with it. Let's just go through the basics. consuming fewer calories than we burn leads to weight loss, okay? So for example, if you were to be burning about 2,500 calories every day and you only consume 200, okay, then you're going to be in a 500 calorie deficit. If you do that for a week, you're in a total deficit of 3,500 calories, and you're going to lose about a pound of fat because there's 3,500 calories in a pound of fat. That's the sort of the conventional wisdom, okay? So in order to eat less, okay, and to get into calorie deficit and lose weight, we either eat less, okay, or we exercise more, or we do a bit of both, okay? Now that appears to make sense, doesn't it? It seems logical, it's mathematical, quite nice, left-brained, all good, fantastic. But there's a fundamental problem with the calorie principle. It is what, anyone? It doesn't work, that's exactly right. Now, how do we know that it doesn't work? We know that it doesn't work because there are countless people that have applied this principle that will have lost weight in the short term, that will have been unable to sustain that for whatever reason, okay? And that is not only an anecdotal, although that's what we find, people tell us these things, it's actually borne out in the science. So here's a little bit of the science in this area. These are basically studies where they've taken people and put them on low-calorie diets, almost always low in fat, so low-fat, low-calorie diets, okay? And in some of these studies, they've also got them to exercise as well, okay? So here's a summary of the evidence, basically. If you look on the left-hand column, this is the length of the study, and then how long after they did the study that they looked at them again, and what the overall weight loss was. One of the most interesting ones, actually, is the one third line down, where it says 24. So they did this intervention for 24 months, okay? And so there was no, like, follow-up as such. It was just one long study. If you look, though, at the average weight losses in these studies, you'll see that when they changed their diet alone, they lost an average of 2 kilograms, basically, which is about 4.5 pounds, okay? And if they added exercise to that, and that was very often about sort of 45 minutes, 3 or 4 times a week. This is quite a lot of aerobic exercise. Sometimes they used a little bit of resistance in there as well. They lost about 3 kilograms, which is about 6.5 pounds, okay? And you might say, well, it's better than nothing, okay? But actually, when you think about how much work and effort went into this, okay, and the fact that these people, started out at about sort of, the 230-pound mark usually, that was the sort of average weight in these studies, then you begin to realize this is an unmitigated failure, okay? There's no other way to explain or to describe that in my view. It is a failure, okay? Now, also in these studies, just bear this in mind, the people in these studies were not working on their own, okay? They had an enormous amount of support generally. So they're attending group session, one-to-one dietary sessions, okay? They've got people motivating them in group exercise or motivating them to do their exercise on their own. They've had a lot of intervention, and look at the results. They are appalling. So what normally happens when people fail applying the calorie principle? Here's my experience. Usually there's a sort of judgment around this. It must work, right? Calorie principle must work. Eating less calories than you burn must work. So if it hasn't worked for you, there's something wrong. And what's wrong is either you've eaten too much, or you haven't exercised enough, okay? Or you're a bit weak-willed and you lack self-control and you've got an inadequate personality, right? And here's the thing, right? A lot of the time, people apply these judgments internally to themselves, right? So they're not even just external. For a lot of people, they think this must work. So if it hasn't worked for me, there's something wrong with me. And I might have, therefore, a weak will, a lack of self-control, and an inadequate personality. Now, these things may be true. I have met a lot of people that you could possibly label with that accusation. However, that isn't necessarily why the thing hasn't worked, okay? Maybe there's something else going on. So let's have a look and see what it is about the calorie principle that doesn't quite stack up, okay? So I'm going to go through a fair amount of detail here relatively quickly, and then I'm going to tell you what works better, all right? So here's the first thing, okay? If you eat, it's a bit like putting fuel on a fire. So what happens when you don't put so much fuel on the fire? well, the fire doesn't burn so well. So one thing we know absolutely categorically is that when people eat less, it puts a bit of a dent in the metabolism, okay? It puts a brake on the metabolism, all right? And this is through a number of different mechanisms, several mechanisms, including things like thyroid hormone changes, changes in the hormone leptin, which I'll talk about in a moment. Also, studies in animals and humans show that when people restrict calories, okay, one of the things that happens is that they move less. They spontaneously move less, okay? Now, there's probably another mechanism that might be going on here around nutrient depletion, because when people eat a low-calorie diet, very often, to be honest, they're eating rubbish, okay? And if you get nutrient depleted, they're eating less and they're eating rubbish, and so if you get nutrient depleted, then you don't necessarily have the nutrients that you need to keep your metabolism going at full tilt, okay? And there is a bit of indirect evidence here, because they did a study on weight loss in women where one group got a placebo, the other one got a multivitamin and mineral, and it speeded weight loss significantly just doing that, okay? Which makes me think this is possibly a mechanism in here. But by the way, the very fact that, you know, when people go on a low-calorie diet and they become very calorie-obsessed, I have noticed, okay, as a result of that, people will tend to eat any old rubbish, like low-calorie foods that are very dubious. And this can also happen, I know this is slightly contentious, with people that are eating a low-carb diet. Just because something is low in carb doesn't make it necessarily healthy. This carpet, you know, is low in carb. This reminds me of something, by the way. I'm going off at a tangent slightly, but baked potatoes, right? I'm sure it's the same in the States as in the UK. These are like icons of healthy eating, but actually they're very disruptive to blood sugar. I'm not saying you shouldn't eat them, but if you're wanting to stabilise blood sugar levels and optimise, say, your weight and health, they're probably not something to be eaten in too large an amount, okay? But why do people believe that baked potatoes are healthy? Because they're low in fat and high in fibre. Well, this carpet is low in fat and high in fibre, okay? And when someone looks at me quizzically, I say, well, here's another thing that's low in fat and high in fibre. Dog shit. Dog shit is low in Because sometimes I've noticed in practice, right, you have to say things like this to get someone's attention. And then I'll say something like, and it's also 0 cholesterol and fresh. Yes. Okay, so what happens when we put a dent in our metabolism this way? Lots of things can happen. But basically, it can make weight loss really slow going, right? This is the original slow burn of Fred Hahn. Okay. Also, it can basically cause people to plateau at a weight way above the weight that they were hoping to get to, all right? And then at this point, okay, they're still eating less. They're probably exercising more as well. And they're not really getting anywhere, so they usually default back to their original diet. And the weight usually goes on very quickly because now they've got this sort of dwindled metabolism, okay? So this is a major, major problem for people, and it happens very, very regularly. Now, is this a new thing? Well, apparently not, because this was actually studied quite a long time ago. So there's an experiment. Has anyone heard of the Minnesota experiment? Okay. Now, the Minnesota experiment was done at the end of the 1940s. So after the Second World War, quite a lot of people had suffered basically from starvation or semi-starvation. And there were some people that were interested in how you would get these people to regain their weight as healthily as possible. So they decided to starve people and then get them to regain their weight, okay? So these are a group of men, okay? And this study was actually administrated. The lead a researcher was someone called Ansel Keys. Please don't recoil in horror, okay? The study was fair enough, okay? It's probably the most important study we have, I think, in this area. And basically what they did was they got these men, and for 24 weeks they got them to eat what they described as a semi-starvation diet, which is 1,600 calories, by the way. Okay, but it was a low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet, as we're generally recommended to eat. So what happened? Well, overall, weight went down by 20 to 26%. Okay, that's all right. Okay, I mean, they were emaciated, and I'll tell you in a moment, they weren't doing so well. But actually, overall metabolism went down by almost 40%. Okay, so the metabolic reduction was even bigger than you would predict as a result of the amount of weight that these people had lost, okay? Now, that doesn't look so good, and worse than that, these men, okay, really suffered at the hands of this diet. I mean, most of them were perpetually thinking about food. Anyone had that before? Okay? Perpetually thinking about food, obsessing about it, thinking about nothing else, having no interest in anything else, so they lost their interest in their families and friends and sex and all sorts of stuff, okay? They lost their senses of humour. A lot of them were chewing gum and drinking coffee incessantly. Anyone here done that on a diet? Okay. And then what they did basically is that at the end of the experiment, they let them eat as much as they liked, basically. I'm summarising this year-long study, but this is what they basically did. And not surprisingly, some of those men ate food voraciously, up to about 4,000 calories a day. So they're stuffing this food in their faces. And what they found out subsequently, looking at the data, is that their appetites seem to be related to fat sort of levels in the body. And as their fat levels came up again, okay, their appetite came down. Sounds all right, doesn't it? But by the time they were eating normally, their fat stores were actually 70% higher than they had been at the start of the study. So 60 years ago, we had pretty good evidence that when you put people on a calorie-restricted, low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet, it messes them up, okay, in a major way. And we've been recommending that diet ever since. So let's have a little look at this, and think about why it is that this thing really can't work for people. And the first thing that I want to talk about is this concept that fat is fattening, okay? So I know this sounds like a glib question, and I can be a bit glib from time to time. Why do we believe that fat is fattening? Okay, so I've heard both the right answers there, okay? One of which is it's got more calories than carbohydrate or protein, about twice as many per gram, all right? The other thing, it's called fat, all right? So we have a branding issue with it, all right, as you would say in the States. Okay, but the thing is really, is it fattening? Well, there's quite a lot of epidemiological... I almost took this point out when I was listening to Denise earlier, because epidemiology is really a load of rubbish, in my view. And I write a blog fairly regularly, not this week maybe, but fairly regularly I write a blog, and I hardly ever write about epidemiological evidence, okay, because I just think there's so little we can learn from it. But as it happens, there's quite a lot of studies that don't show a correlation between the amount of fat that people eat and their weight, okay? But more importantly than that, what happens when people go on low-fat diets? That's the real test of low fat, and here's what happens. Not very much good happens. That's what really happens. This was summarized in a form of what's called a meta-analysis by a group of researchers called the Cochrane Collaboration, who took all the kind of low-fat studies where they were comparing low fat with diets that might be restricted in calories but weren't explicitly low in fat. And what they found was the low-fat diets underperformed the other sorts of diets consistently, and at the end of 18 months of low-fat eating there was a net gain in weight overall. Okay? Now this study actually was withdrawn 3 or 4 years later, and I asked the Cochrane Collaboration why it had been withdrawn. I was interested, why would you take it? And the answer that I was given was, well, they had no plans to update the data, so now they're pretending it didn't happen. Well, they didn't say that, but that's what it appears to be. Okay, so look, the bottom line is this, is that it appears that, low-fat diets can't really work, to be perfectly frank. And so all I would say is this, is that, this is a major theme that people have in their heads, that fat is fattening, that if they eat a low-fat diet, then they're destined to lose weight. And actually, we have a pretty good idea it doesn't really work that way. So why doesn't it work that way? Well, you could look at other things, that cause fat deposition in the body. Forget about calories, which is what I often tell my patients. Forget about calories. Forget them. Concentrate on this. What would cause more fat to get in fat cells? Okay, what does that? Well, this is nuanced. It's kind of complex. I'm not saying it's just one thing, but one part of this puzzle is insulin. So, we have fat floating around the bloodstream, often in the form of what are called triglycerides, okay? When they come along to a fat cell, they can't get in, right? Now, all of you, from what I could see from yesterday, I've read Gary Taub's book, so you'll know this, okay? But just so we go through this, to get into the fat cells, triglycerides need to be deassembled, and one thing that does that is a hormone called lipoprotein lipase, okay? Well, insulin actually enhances that hormone that allows more potential for fat to get into fat cells. Once they're there, to fix them, they have to be made into triglycerides again. So one way you can do that is to take 3 fats along with something called glycerol. Glycerol comes from what? It actually comes from glucose, and insulin facilitates glucose transport into cells. Also, to get out again, it needs to be disassembled, right? So to be disassembled, you need the action of a hormone called hormone-sensitive lipase, and that is inhibited by insulin. So if you want the skinny on this, basically fat facilitates the uptake of fat into fat cells and stops it getting out, basically. So you could argue it is probably overall a bit fattening, right? And the other thing that it does is actually stimulate production of fat in the liver. Okay, so we probably don't want a huge amount of insulin. And the fact of the matter is that, as you all know, carbohydrates drive insulin secretion, some more than, if you eat a bowl of spinach, it's not going to do much. It's basically carbohydrate, isn't it? Some water. But, if you eat something like a baked potato, that's going to be generally more problematic. There's more food there, and it's generally more disruptive. Insulin also is triggered by protein, okay? Not as much as carbohydrate overall, but that does happen. We'll talk about that again in a moment. And then we've got fat. Fat doesn't really cause much insulin secretion, okay, if any at all, okay? So you could argue, if you look at it this way, if insulin is important in fat production, maybe the diet should be actually quite rich in fat, quite low in carbohydrates, particularly those that disrupt blood sugar, and a bit of protein there, probably not too bad. But let's go on from here and look at what happens when people eat high carb. They make a lot of sugar in the bloodstream as a result of that. They're going to make a lot of insulin, and then what can happen? They can become what?
Metabolically deranged.
Metabolically deranged, yes, wasn't what I had in my head, but they can become a bit insulin resistant, can't they, right? So insulin isn't really doing its job. So what happens? Blood sugar levels tend to be on the high side. That can be damaging to the body, by the way. We'll look at that again in a moment. And then another thing that can happen is that glucose is not effectively being transported into the cells, as other fuels may not be. And then what's happening here to the brain? The brain is now a bit insulin resistant, so it's not getting adequate fuel. So how may that manifest? Like Alzheimer's, possibly, actually, yes. But what? On a day-to-day level? Hungry and depressed and a bit mentally lethargic and blah, blah, blah. And the same in the muscles, okay? If they're not getting adequate fuel, it's a bit difficult to have energy. So you don't want this situation, do you? If you're attempting to be healthy and, optimize your weight and well-being, you don't want to be in an insulin-resistant state. So maybe you need to think about not eating too much rubbish carbohydrate. We'll come on to that again in a moment. So here's another hormone that has some influence on weight, and it's leptin. So most of you will have heard of this. It's secreted by the fat cells. It goes to the brain. What does it do? Two main things. It suppresses appetite, and it stimulates the metabolism. That's fantastic. So we would like our leptin to be doing a good job wherever possible. However, from time to time in certain individuals, leptin won't function so well. This is called leptin resistance. At its core appears to be the process inflammation. What causes inflammation? Well, one thing that causes inflammation is spikes in blood sugar that come from eating what? Carbohydrate, okay, that's good. Okay, here's another thing. Where are we here? Okay. The other thing is that there is a little bit of evidence that when you eat carbohydrate, there's plenty of evidence that when you eat carbohydrate, triglycerides go up. But triglycerides, there's some evidence there that links them with the inability now of leptin to get through the blood-brain barrier into the brain where it exerts its effect. So that's probably not a good thing if that indeed happens. The other thing is that omega-6 fats, our sunflower oils and many of the fats that we find in processed and fast food are pro-inflammatory, and we don't want too much inflammation in the body because inflammation specifically here in the brain and the hypothalamus can be problematic for us, okay? Now, are there any other reasons why we shouldn't eat a calorie-reduced diet? Yes, here's one other reason, okay? It makes cortisol levels go up. Now, you must have cortisol in the body. Without it, it's very difficult to function properly, okay? And most people will be very fatigued. But too much cortisol is potentially a factor in obesity because it predisposes to fat gain, particularly around the middle, visceral fat in the abdomen and around the organs, for example. It also breaks down muscle, so you could end up losing some muscle, gaining some fat, and Fred Hahn would not be very happy if you did that. Okay, so it's also quite strongly linked with things like heart disease and diabetes. So this is just yet another reason why you would not necessarily want to eat an explicitly calorie-restricted diet, okay? Here's another little thing about diet, and I'm getting onto this idea that certain diets might have metabolic advantage, okay? It's a very contentious issue. I'll just discuss it with you briefly, but let's just start with this. There is something in nutrition known as the thermogenic effect of food. Now, basically, when you eat food, right, not all of that food has the potential to be stored as, say, fat or something else in your body. Some of that energy will be lost, generally as heat, which is where the term thermogenic comes from. So heat inducing, if you like, effects from food. So it is a bit like putting fuel on a fire. Now, for example, if you had some protein in your body, you might break it down into amino acids and then reassemble it into protein again, and that wastes energy, okay? So this is one of the reasons, okay, that certain foods might have what's called a metabolic advantage, because if you lose a lot of energy, okay, from a food in this way, then less of it is going to be available for you to store as fat, fundamentally, okay? So what's the most thermogenic food stuff, or rather macronutrient specifically? No. It's protein, actually, okay? So there's an argument for possibly, you know, a relatively protein-rich and not very carbohydrate-rich diet being useful here. The other thing is that when you adopt, say, a low-carbohydrate diet, you might want to produce some glucose, okay, from protein, and that also sort of wastes energy. So that all brings me on to this basic question: is a calorie a calorie? So I know you'll be familiar with this concept. Many people that work in the weight loss field, most doctors, most researchers say a calorie is a calorie. It's irrespective of the form of the calories. It's only the number of calories that count here. Now, I get the logic of that, maybe, all right? But here's the thing, just intuitively now, does that really make sense? I mean, if you look at the many different ways that different macronutrients affect hormone levels and metabolism or whatever, and thermogenic effects, it doesn't, for me, feel quite right that that is how it really is, okay? So let's just very, very quickly summarize each of the major macronutrients, okay? Carbohydrate. Now, this stimulates insulin secretion, some of them a lot of insulin secretion, which, you know, makes fat go into fat cells and basically sticks it there, right? And also you get spikes in blood sugar, which are inflammatory, which could disrupt your ability to respond properly to leptin. That isn't looking so good as far as I'm concerned, okay? Actually, fat looks significantly better for me, okay, because less insulin secretion would mean more opportunities for fat to get out of fat cells and not get in there in the first place, possibly. And then the other thing is certain fats are actually anti-inflammatory, notably the omega-3 fats that we find in things like oily fish. And what of protein? Well, protein does stimulate insulin secretion, but generally not as much as carbohydrate, and it might have some metabolic advantage through those mechanisms that I just talked about. So if you were to think about this, just looking at all of this data, you might say, well, actually, possibly the best diet for us in terms of optimizing weight would be relatively high in fat, moderate in protein, and low in carbohydrate. Now, here's the question. Is there any evidence for that? Has anyone actually looked at it? Well, of course they have. A number of researchers over the years have taken diets of different composition and fed them to people to see whether they have similar or different effects on weight, okay? Now, there are plenty of studies that show no difference. There really are plenty of studies, okay? So to be fair, we should at least nod in their direction. However, a lot of these studies are relatively short in duration, and sometimes you need a fair amount of time to be able to determine whether something is beneficial or not. Anyway, there is some evidence, okay, that there is indeed different effects of different calories on weight. One of the first studies was this one, done in the 1950s, where they took a group of individuals, some of you will be familiar with this study maybe, and they put them on really quite extreme diets for a short amount of time, but they also found quite significant differences on changes in weight relatively quickly here. The best diet was the one high in fat, which you absolutely would predict, by the way, from what we know about the impact of different macronutrients on those factors that we talked about earlier. Now, there's a whole bunch of other studies that show this as well, by the way. And, you know, you can say, well, it wasn't perfectly done and they weren't, you know, locked up in a ward and blah, blah, blah. But there is at least some evidence that suggests that basically when you compare diets of similar calorie content with different composition, okay, then we get different effects on weight loss, okay? So here's the next thing. Even if that isn't true, let's imagine a calorie is a calorie after all, right? Maybe that's true. It's really difficult to tell, actually. But even if it is true, here's one thing that I think is really important. If someone's going to lose weight and sustain that weight loss happily and healthily, they can't really afford to get very, very hungry, okay? Because when people get hungry, it really saps at the resolve, and willpower is a little bit like a muscle. There's evidence to suggest that when you exert your willpower, it makes you weaker for a while afterwards, okay? So it is really very hard going through life being sort of permanently semi-hungry or very hungry, all right? So do we have any advantages here from eating a diet, basically, that is relatively low in carbohydrate? And I would say possibly yes, because protein, calorie for calorie, appears to satisfy the appetite more than fat or carbohydrate, okay? So, you know, a bit of protein in the diet, not necessarily such a bad thing. Also, possibly now, high-fat diets can promote weight loss because they can promote weight loss. So you've got fat loss coming out of the fat cells. Where does it go? Into the bloodstream. And then where might it go? Well, possibly into the muscles, right? So what's going to happen there? You can now use that fat for fuel. So one of the concepts is this, is that when you're eating a diet that is causing true weight loss from your fat cells, you may not be very hungry because what you're not eating is being supplemented by your fat. You've now become like a hibernating bear, if you like, okay? Which isn't bad. Just think about that for a moment. You're not very hungry, you're energized, okay, and you're losing fat. That is a fantastic state to be in, but you will never get in that state, obviously, if you're eating generally a very carbohydrate-rich diet. The other thing is carbohydrate-rich diets don't tend to be very satisfying, do they? And a lot of people will have blood sugar disruption as a result of eating high carbohydrate diets, so up and then down, then you get this sort of false hunger and food cravings for more carbohydrate, and then you're on this roller coaster, which can be difficult to get off unless you restrict some carbohydrate, basically. So here's what happens basically to individuals that basically adopt a lower carbohydrate diet very often, and you may know this from your own experience. They'll very often eat less, and often substantially less. Now, I had breakfast a couple of mornings ago with Eric Westman, and he told me, I don't think you'll mind me telling, are you here, Eric? No, okay. I go, oh, I see. And he told me, I'm just not hungry. And that is not atypical at all for people that restrict carbohydrates. And typically they will eat a lot less, not because they're consciously restricting carbohydrate, but because they're just not very hungry. That is not a bad thing in my view, all right? So here's a few reasons for not eating a low-fat, calorie-restricted diet. Suppression of the metabolism, okay? Reduced energy expenditure, because very often people will move less. Nutrient deficiencies, potentially. Hunger and preoccupation with food, you know, all those kind of issues. You might have a biochemical state through the production of insulin that is actually predisposing to fat gain. Insulin resistance, which can make people hungry and tired. Leptin functioning, not so good. So what might that happen? Lower metabolism than people should have, and possibly more appetite than they should have. We haven't finished. Reduced leptin functioning. So as a result here of possibly triglycerides blocking the uptake of leptin into the brain. Raised cortisol levels, not ideal. Generally would predispose to muscle loss and fat gain. And basically a diet that has limited ability to sate the appetite properly, and therefore an enhanced risk of hunger and food cravings and all of the problems that go along with that. Now, I don't want to sound glib, but I do want to say good luck with that, okay? Honestly, I sometimes say to people, it's not that diets don't work, fundamentally they can't work, okay, for all but a small minority of people, all right? So what's the solution? You probably want to avoid foods that are disruptive to blood sugar, don't you? Okay, and therefore insulin, and also leptin. And you probably want to put a bit more emphasis on protein and fat maybe, and not so much on rubbish carbohydrates. That basically equals a low-carb diet. It could also be a paleo diet. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. Some people ask me, is that low-carb, paleo, you know, whatever. I'm actually for all of these things. I'm for anything, okay, that's better than what the person was doing before, quite frankly. Now, one of the great things, I don't use a lot of branding. I tell you, when I write a book, I hardly talk about low carb or paleo, because some people have resistance to that. They think low carb and then it's Atkins and yeah, he's a quack and blah, blah, blah. You know, you get that a lot. There's a major problem in the UK. So I don't even talk about it. I just thought, this is how we should eat. And then sometimes at the end of a lecture, someone will go, is that a bit like Atkins? And I'll go, yes. But the thing is, they have no resistance to it now. You see, because it's made sense in their brain. Anyway. Here are studies where they've basically taken people, put them on low-fat diets and compared that with putting people on low-carb diets where they have not restricted calories. The low-fat diets restricted in calories, low-carbohydrate diets not restricted in calories. On the right-hand side, I've put whether the result was statistically significant or not. Basically, in every case here, all right, whether it was statistically significant or not, the low-carb one out, okay, in these situations. I tried to look as much of the evidence as I could find, and this is what I found. Now, statistically significant, is that important? I'm not sure, okay, because sometimes studies have to be quite big to show the statistical significance, okay? And if you went to someone and said, look, there's basically 2 options here. You can go on this calorie-restricted diet that's going to make you hungry and miserable, okay, and you're going to have to consciously restrict how much you eat, or you can go on this other diet. And by the way, the former diet, you'll lose an average, you know, in studies of 11 kilograms, the other one 15 kilograms. I know which one they generally would choose. And also, if you said to them, but by the way, that difference in weight from the studies is not statistically significant, they'll still go, I'll take the 15. Thank you. Do you know what I mean? Anyway, I just want to finish with this. Does exercise promote weight loss? The answer to that is not really, okay? If you do aerobic exercise, I know it all makes sense, but if you add that to a diet, let's say you lose, I don't know, 20 kilograms over 6 months, instead of losing 20 kilograms, if you add exercise to it, you've lost 21 on average. That's what the studies show. You lose an additional couple of pounds, okay? Now, you might have done literally dozens of hours of exercise in order to achieve that additional loss in weight. And most people, once they understand that, are not really prepared to do it. And they're probably, by the way, I'm a reformed runner, okay? So when Denise said she was a reformed vegan, I've never been vegan. In fact, I've had in my life 2 vegetarian girlfriends, and it was torture. For a whole bunch of reasons. And so there was I, oh yeah, I should be really sensitive, and I was just permanently hungry. Permanently hungry is a terrible experience. Okay. Okay, so the fact is that exercise doesn't really work that way and that well. And why is that? Anyone? Any thoughts? Why?
Makes you hungry.
Makes you hungry, and what else? Here's the truth, it doesn't really burn that many calories. And anyone that exercises on a piece of equipment that counts calories will know this, okay? So you need to be careful with exercise because it doesn't really work as we would anticipate that it works. What works, I think, is resistance exercise. Could be slow burn, okay? Doesn't have to be. There's other resistance exercises out there, by the way. And good generally for, in my view, strengthening the body and toning the body. That's important. It can really improve how someone looks once they take their clothes off, just with even just exercises that you're doing in the comfort of your own home on your bedroom floor. Okay, and I also am quite a believer in high intensity intermittent exercise. Okay, this is basically where people will, I don't know, be sprinting, doing something on a bike or sprinting, you know, for 8-10 seconds usually, and then they slacken off for 20 seconds, something like that, and they repeat that. It is a very good way, in my experience, for people to get very fit, to lose some fat if that's what they're interested in, very, very quickly. It's not for everyone. It's brutal. Anyone here ever done high intensity intermittent? It is brutal, okay? It's not an easy thing to do, but it's very time efficient and generally very effective. So here's a few things not to do, in my view, okay, if you want to optimize your health and lose weight. Don't consciously restrict calories. Don't eat a low-fat diet. Don't get too hungry. Don't shop for food when you're hungry either. That's just asking for trouble, as you know. Don't engage in prolonged periods of aerobic exercise. I say that as a reformed runner, as I said. Don't let odd slips or splurges derail you. You know, very often people, when they're on a diet, and I'm really anti-diet, obviously, as you can tell, will think that, you know, they're doing quite well, and then they go out and then they weaken and they eat tiramisu, and then that's it for the next few months. They're eating rubbish, right? So if you want to, you know, go off piste, as we say, that's fine. But what I suggest people do is make a mental sort of stop point on when they're going to stop doing that thing. So, for example, if I go on what you would call a bucks party, but we call a stag weekend, okay, I know it's going to be messy. I absolutely understand that. I'm driving there knowing that. But in my head, I'm going, Sunday night is when this stops, okay? So when I get up in the morning, I don't eat bowls of cereal on Monday morning and toast, okay? I eat exactly what I normally do. Do you see? So that really does help people generally, you know, have the odd, you know, indulgence and slip up or whatever you want to call it, and do it with impunity, all right? Don't see changes as a diet. Okay, here's a few things to do. Focus on the quality rather than quantity of food, of course. More emphasis on protein and fat, probably overall, less on rubbishy carbohydrate. I generally advocate that about 80% of the diet for people that aren't actively losing weight would be made up of what I would regard as primal, Paleolithic, whatever you want to call it, foods. Meat, fish, eggs, you know, some nuts if they like, fruits and vegetables, not too much fruit if they're losing weight, generally speaking. That sort of stuff, not, as I've said, the sort of the rubbish stuff that we're generally recommended to eat. I also recommend that people don't allow themselves to get very hungry. I can't tell you how important this is as a factor. So very often I'll say to people, look, the less hungry you are, the more weight you'll lose. And once they understand this, they really get that in their head and they go, oh, I can see how that would work, okay? So on a scale of 0 to 10, where 0 is no hunger and 10 is I'll eat this podium, okay, then I generally, and you know what that feels like, right? You generally, in my view, want to be about a 6 or a 7 before you eat. You don't want to be not hungry. You don't want to be starving either. I'm a big fan of walking as an ex-runner now, and I do believe in resistance exercise. And if you really want to push it a bit of high intensity, if that's your thing, okay? I also believe in, getting your mindset right and very much working towards whatever goal it is that you're looking to. So focus on the positive, not trying to get away from the negative, if you like. And also, I really encourage people to see there's not some sort of penance. This is just healthy eating. This is how we should be eating. This is not a diet. It's not something to get on and get off necessarily. Of course, you can have your occasional, off-piste moments, right? But this is basically something positive, right? This is the sort of thing that allows people, okay, to lose weight if that's what they're seeking to do, but fundamentally feel so much better and have a much more functional relationship with food than they used to have, okay? So, this doesn't work for me. Someone put this up yesterday. Was it Monique? Was it you, Monique? It doesn't really, exactly. It doesn't work for anyone particularly, in my view. Okay, so there's a number of different ways we could criticise this, but quite frankly, we're not going to. I like this. I saw this. Don't eat processed cow. That's fantastic. I like that. All right. Here's another one I like. Yeah, that kind of works. Okay, but you know what? There's always people that are just going to take it that step too far. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you.